can you tell me a little bit about yourself and the things that you do, the company you work for?
Sure. So my name's Selena and I work for a company called Fresho. We're based out of Melbourne, Australia, but we are also in New Zealand, the UK, and soon to be launching in California at the end of the year. We're a B2B SaaS platform in the fresh food industry. So we're all about providing the platform for like suppliers or distributors to order from their wholesalers or from their farmers and then get their food into restaurants and down to chefs as well. So that's me.
I'm Michael Molesky. I work for a company called Zepto. We're a better way to pay. We're based in Byron Bay, which is one of the most picturesque places in Australia, but we're a remote workplace, so I work from Melbourne. Basically, Zepto is an API for account-to-account movement of money, but we've also got a number of people working with the government as new kind of infrastructure and new ideas are coming out in the way banking changes in Australia. So we're mostly based in Australia. We've just moved into New Zealand, but the future is looking good, and we may even come to Australia, to America one day.
Oh, cool. So how long have you been working with Rails?
With Rails? Myself, I'm actually also a self-taught coder. So maybe 8 or 9 years ago is when I started learning to code. Started with some really low-level stuff, like binary hex conversions and logic gates and things like that. Quickly moved on to Assembly 68K and C, and then into Ruby. Once I started working with Ruby, didn't kind of look back. So yeah, about 7 or 8 years for me.
I was working probably with Rails back in 2010, so that must be about 13 years ago when one of the big companies in Australia, realestate.com.au, had an agile transformation, and one of the selections there was to use Ruby and Rails. So I was leading that team back in 2010, but I have been a coder since 2000, so it's kind of interesting as I've seen all the ups and downs of the industry for the last 23 years.
Wow. So what were you programming in earlier before Rails? Do you still go back to some of the
not that much. I think when I started, Perl was actually really hot. There was a lot of cool stuff being done in Perl, so I picked up Perl and was writing a dashboard for the local broadband provider. Then we moved into Java. I didn't really like Java that much, so I thought, how about going back to Perl, which brought me back to real estate, and they had then problems with the way that code was being developed. I wonder why with Perl. So that's when we switched to Ruby, and again, I haven't really looked back. Obviously, there's a bit of JavaScript here and there, but yes, prior to that was Perl and Java.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So what parts of Rails do you like the most?
I mean, that's a good question. I think in a way Rails is almost too good for itself. It's interesting to see what's happened in the JavaScript landscape with so many frameworks, because certain things don't work very well, which means there's room for all of that. Whereas what's happened in Ruby community is Rails has actually fit the bill for so many broad projects. It's really hard for either a Sinatra, a Rhoda, Hanami to kind of break through. I think the general kind of environment that you have a way of doing things, you have your views, controllers pretty much kind of set in stone. You have active record that kind of does a lot of right things. Certainly there's a lot of things that you then that can break once you start scaling and things like that. But it's hard to kind of point out to one particular thing at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's all pretty good, and I like what they're doing going forward with Rails 7 and the upgrades with 5 and 6 as well. They seem to be keeping abreast of some of the kind of interests right now.
And for me, it's just really quick and easy to be working with Rails. So where I'm working at Fresho, we have a Rails backend. We did have Ember in the front end when I first started out, Ember.js. Don't know if anyone still uses that. Yeah,
I've used Ember.js.
Okay.
No, I don't use it anymore, but yeah.
Not too many people using it now. We certainly don't have any developers who are really across it. We're actually in the process of ripping out that Ember. It's just kind of in a core part of the app at the moment. So if we are going to use JavaScript, we're going to use like React or potentially Stimulus and Vue components. But for the most part, wherever possible, whenever we're doing any kind of plain old configuration, we're just using plain old Rails pages, which means it's really, really quick and easy for us to just bang out features.
Right. So are there parts of Rails that you don't like? Or it could be better,
Well, I mean, obviously bits of bits of active record where you have after what do they call the after
After save hook.
after save hook,
yeah,
right? There's a lot of sharp knives out there. That being one of them. I think this is where ideas like DryRB and some of the kind of the concepts they bring in there of hexagonal style architectures.
Right.
I mean, I mentioned active record is good, and it's good because it gets people up and running really quickly. But ultimately, it again misses out on some of that. The idea of having a hexagonal architecture of actually modeling your domain separately from what's in the database, which as your app grows, you start to really see the limitations of that. And as your app grows, you end up working a lot against that and bringing in things like packwork to either separate your different parts of your app into modules, or even bringing in kind of repository style patterns just to kind of separate what's actually modeled in the database versus the models that make sense in your app.
Yeah, and I think one of the downsides of Rails is actually also a huge benefit, right? It's so easy for people to get up and running when they're new to Rails that you don't really have to have this kind of low-level understanding and know all the bits and pieces behind what's going on, which means anyone who comes in, or anyone who's kind of a junior or sort of, especially self-taught developers as well, they come in and they don't understand what's happening under the covers. They don't even realize, is this part of Rails, or is this part of Ruby, or is this part of something else? But like I said, that is a positive as well as negative.
Yeah. I mean, it abstracts it so well that you don't know. I mean, it's almost magic, right?
Absolutely.
And talking about after save hooks, there is a pretty interesting story. We had one of our clients when I was working with them. So they were making a network call in the after save, and the network call failed, and it rolled back the entire transaction. But the network call failed for different reasons, so the side effect had already happened on the network call. Yeah, that was a very interesting debugging session on that. Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of talk about like magnificent monoliths. Sometimes monoliths tend to kind of like mesh together, and there's a little bit of spaghetti inside that magnificence. So what are your thoughts on like magnificent monoliths? You talked a little bit about packwork and how you could set those things up, but is there a better way to organize your code?
Yeah, so at Zepto, we're in I suppose what we call in Australia scale up, where we've got a market fit. We're just trying to make our product better and make it grow bigger, which means also we've just come out of startup. We've got a bit of a mess on certain things that we've done, and certainly the domain doesn't always match the way we need to scale things. So we've got APIs that need to scale differently, from reporting parts of the system that need to scale differently, from real-time bits of code that need to talk to banking APIs and send webhooks and that kind of thing. We did look at breaking it up into a microservices architecture, and having some experience from working at Fresho and previously at Redbubble, it was certainly something that sounded cool. I am very skeptical, though, of the amount of need to get new servers up, to get new code bases up, to get everyone across it and not leave a dead service lying around. And we already had one of those at Zepto when I came there, which was like, oh yeah, there's this other thing that some people use. In the end, we actually got the response from our SRE team, our site reliability engineering team, and they said, we're just flat out, we're not going to be able to help you put out new pods and things. So we said, well, what other opportunities are there? And we ended up building a microservice-like infrastructure through packages in using packwork. So we basically said, right, we have a reporting service which will probably scale differently, may even use different database adapters in the future. And we said, right, let's just put it in a separate folder, packages, compliance reporting, and in that, make sure the barrier isn't broken. But we actually publish data to that using an event bus style architecture. In future to be using Kafka, but for the moment we're just using Postgres. And it just meant that quite a small team could move very quickly, had no issues deploying. Obviously, there are certain limitations. We're still a small team all up, which means the whole app, the dependency on deployment and the whole app wasn't a problem for us to be deploying. Obviously, if you're in a microservice, you can just deploy it a lot faster.
Right.
So there are certain kind of trade-offs, but certainly from moving from a monolith, I think the step to breaking the domain down into microservices is less problematic. It's easy to fix problems when you've got them. you have a huge benefit by having your linting, your code quality tools, all of your security patches on one code base rather than potentially multiple code bases. So that's the choice we made. There certainly are, as we're going to scale, there will be needs for potentially being able to scale parts of that differently.
Right.
There's a few talks that I'm really looking forward to on doing that,
Right.
and a few interesting things from Shopify in particular that are looking at being able to deploy a monolith but only having certain packages activated and scale differently from the rest of the monolith.
Yeah, and at Fresho, we are very much still a monolith. We have been able to figure out that there is a particular petition that we want to be able to make. So we have started teasing apart the domain and sort of introduce these concepts of different directories where, you know, if you've got models in one directory, they can't reach into the other directory. And we try to keep those separated in the database as well. But we are ultimately still one monolith, one database. And we started teasing it apart. We didn't get much further than that because we are in the scale up stage. We are a small team. We do need to kind of deliver product value as well at this point in time. So there's a bit of a tension there between the business and the tech team about where do we prioritize that time and how do we do it. So we are kind of in the process of trying to do that. Although we don't have, we've got vague ideas of where the future might be, sort of right-sized services, but we don't have the ideal path forward. So that's kind of an interesting time for us. There was something else I was going to say. It was going to be really good. I'm sorry, I forgot.
That's quite all right. So you gave a talk on pair programming today. Do you do pair programming at Zepto and Fresho?
Yeah, correct. We did give a talk about pair programming. Michael and I used to work together at Fresho. Michael moved on to Zepto a couple of years ago. And at Fresho, what we do is quote unquote 100% pair programming. We were, at the time when Michael and I were working together there, we were always in person, 2 devs, 1 machine in the office. Obviously, COVID sent everyone home, so we started doing things remote. At Fresho, we are still 100% pair programming, but now we're doing the remote version. And so, yeah, those fun times in the office is what inspired us for our talk.
So at Zepto, we probably don't do very much pairing at all. I think one of the reasons I left Fresho was I had learned so much from some of the people there, in particular about approaches to testing, approaches to keeping code quality, approaches to design, and approaches to coding and pairing, that I thought this is my opportunity to go and try and bring those ideas into other companies. So certainly a lot of that has kind of paid off. The pairing is interesting. I think a company that hasn't got a top-down pairing kind of mandate and doesn't hire people saying we're going to be pairing 100%, which is what Fresho does, is already a step behind, because you haven't formed a team where everyone wants to pair and everyone wants to test in a particular way. What that means is I end up pairing probably more so with the juniors, because they see the opportunity, they see that they can actually move forward on a lot of their cards much faster, they can learn new things. I'm obviously in that case very conscious of my inequality here with a junior, so I always make sure they're driving. Mostly in remote pairing, we just use video conferencing. If they don't get something, I very clearly make it my fault, because obviously I haven't described the context well enough. So that works really well. What surprises me is some of the senior devs aren't as open to pairing as you would want them to, and that generally just means it's really, really hard to bring architectural changes along, to bring code changes along and things like that. So work in progress still.
Oh, awesome. I used to work for ThoughtWorks, and we did 100% pairing as that.
Right. Yeah. So the first CTO at Fresho, Kieran Fowler, was an ex-Thought worker.
Okay. And I can see where that comes from.
Yeah, that's where he brought in a lot of his concepts.
Right.
Full on TDD, pair programming, trunk-based development.
Right. Awesome. So the community has been talking about moving away from the cloud to managing your own infrastructure. That seems, it might work for Basecamp, but community adopting as a whole, what are your thoughts on it?
I can't see Fresho doing that anytime soon. Certainly, we want to be all around the world, and we're all working from Melbourne. It makes it a lot easier to have it all in the cloud. Like you said, it works for DHH and Basecamp. I don't know that it's the future.
It is interesting how these things kind of come around in circles. I heard a talk by Dave Thomas, who's one of the Dave Thomases, but he was actually saying that people were bringing machines back into on-prem for GPU and heavy processing because it was actually cheaper to buy these machines than start to rent them out from AWS once you were doing a certain amount of data. This actually got me thinking, and I kind of shared it with Selena. I said, hey, we could do a talk in future, like a developer versus developer smackdown. Should it be in cloud or on-prem? Because there certainly was an interest that way, and as you said, it's becoming more of an interest. I have seen. I said we're not a bank; we're a payments API, but I do know of banks that in Australia that are kind of hip and deploy many times a day, and they do actually run some infrastructure and have for things like testing, etc., because they potentially have customer-like data there. So for them, it was just a security concern. As always, I think it's client server, web services, whatever option you want. These things go around in circles, and certainly I'm sure there are exceptions where it makes sense and exceptions where it doesn't. As Selena mentioned, both of our companies are currently in that scale up. So for us, trying to manage on-prem would probably just be too much. I think once you scale to a certain level, certainly evaluate your options. I know we actually are connected to the Swift network. So for that, we had to have very specific hardware. We had a design that was approved by the Swift kind of banking service. We had to have all sorts of failovers. We actually needed somebody to get into a data center and wire things up. Now, that wasn't our speciality, and it actually cost us a lot because we went out to tender for a lot of professionals and they promised the world but delivered nothing. And in the end, we ended up finding a really good engineer who kind of came in and said, look, the people who initially did your wiring didn't even get that right. So I worry about that. I mean, I love a bit of hardware. I got a couple of Raspberry Pis even here with me. But, that's one thing to say, cool, I can run a server. But it's another thing to say, can you actually run a system on-prem somewhere that is scalable and that you want to look after and you want to have the speciality. So I think it probably at the end of the day would come down to cost value and having those specialists on your team.
Makes sense. So are there other technologies that you're looking at apart from Rails?
Well, we do a little bit of React in our talk as well. Some JavaScript here and there. We are doing some hardware, like Michael mentioned. We do have another talk coming up very soon on the other side of the world, where we are building some hardware with actually other versions of Ruby. But it does mean that we need to do a little bit of C in there as well. And are you going to do some Kotlin? No?
Well, yeah, as well. But I think the question's more in our workplaces. Is there any other technology?
I mean, if you're also interested in other things.
I mean,
like
Rust. We're going to rebuild it in Rust.
Absolutely. Rebuild it in Rust. Obviously, everybody's going to rebuild everything in Rust, like including me.
Look, I'm a as much as I love technology, and the only reason I learn Rust is to try and feel like a noob again, like just to understand what junior developers go through, or you just scratch your head and you go, I have no idea what this is doing. But I think often it's really, really hard to sell that to the company. So right now, we're looking at making our database more scalable beyond the current scale, beyond the future horizon, maybe the 2 to 5 year time. So we're looking at real-time databases like Google Spanner, which is extremely expensive with atomic clocks and all of this stuff. Another one's CockroachDB, which is a distributed database that allows you to write to one node and that gets replicated across all the nodes. Really, really cool technology. I'd love to play with it. But something for me says, the problem we're solving, and I don't know where we're going to be in 5 years' time, can still be very well solved with Postgres.
True.
The APIs that we're writing can still be, like, sure, I'd love to give other libraries a go, maybe even write a Rust service, but a lot of them can still be solved by Ruby on Rails, Active Record, Postgres, and Sidekick to process some background jobs. Most of the time, these things are just a question of writing them the right way. Now, I think in our case, we will probably need a very durable event log. So we are going to use Kafka for that. The alternatives, trying to write some of that stuff yourself is just not worth it. And we've already got a few problems in our, or come across a few problems where you're writing to 2 data stores. So it becomes a problem when you write to one and you have to write to the other, but you have to make sure it's written, and you've got to kind of, it's not an easy problem to solve. So certainly having tools for that. So in our case, an event store probably using Kafka is certainly something we'll look at in the future.
And at our company, a few of us kind of have the sort of view for production apps, for, you're working for somebody, keep it plain, keep it simple, stick with the things that you know and you know that it works. And if you want to try something, do it on your side projects.
Yeah.
So that's where, like I said, Michael and I have a few talks coming up where we are experimenting with other tools that I can't see myself using at a day-to-day.
Is it like mRuby?
Yes, we're trying some mRuby on Arduino, some C Ruby on a server, and some JRuby on a mobile device.
Oh, cool.
Hopefully it all works out, but it's a long shot.
Nice. Would you like to give a shout out to anybody or some open source projects or anybody else?
I mean, look, just the general Ruby community is fantastic. We were recently on the Ruby on Rails podcast, and Brittany does an amazing job there. I've kind of refound some Ruby podcasts recently, so I've been kind of listening to those. And on that, I suppose if anyone listens to in JavaScript, there's JavaScript Jam as well by Scott Steinlage. And Steinlage, there you go. I knew I'd get it wrong. But he's entertaining. So yeah, look, I think we know there's a lot of cool projects out there, but I do like that community aspect, the people that sit down and have that chat. So so Ruby on Rails podcast or the JavaScript Jam podcast.
And obviously, huge shout out to everyone who's a core maintainer of Ruby on Rails, because we wouldn't be here without you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely put the links to the podcast in the post. Yeah, that'll be awesome. Thanks for taking the time. It was awesome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you.